The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
There are television moments that make you laugh out loud. There are moments that make you wince. And then there are moments so extraordinary in their audacity that they do both things simultaneously and then follow you around for the next 50 years. Fawlty Towers produced one of those moments. A scene so bold, so wildly misjudged by its central character, and so uncomfortable in its comedy that it became simultaneously the most celebrated and most controversial thing the show ever put to screen. It is the scene that defines Fawlty Towers. It is also the scene that nearly destroyed it. To understand why that moment hit the way it did, why it still hits the way it does, you have to understand the unusual DNA of the show itself. Fawlty Towers was never meant to be gentle. It was never meant to play it safe, to flatter its audience, or to offer the warm comfort of a cozy British sitcom. It was built on confrontation. It was built on embarrassment. It was built on the specific, agonizing comedy of watching someone make every situation catastrophically worse through sheer force of stupidity, pride, and self-delusion. And it was built on one of the most extraordinary real-life inspirations in the history of British television. John Cleese did not invent Basil Fawlty in a writer's room. He did not conjure him from thin air. He met him. The year was 1970, and the Monty Python team had arrived in the seaside town of Torquay, Devon, to film location sequences for their television series. They needed accommodation. What they found at a particular local hotel was something none of them had ever encountered before and would never quite forget. The manager of that establishment, a real, living, breathing human being employed in the hospitality trade, operated with a level of hostility, suspicion, and incompetence so theatrical it almost defied belief. Guests were not welcomed. They were tolerated barely, and often only under visible protest. Complaints were met not with apology, but with contempt. The man's manner suggested he viewed every arriving visitor as a personal inconvenience, possibly a threat. Cleese, being Cleese, did not simply check out early and find another hotel. He watched. He studied. He filed away every absurd incident with the precision of a naturalist documenting a newly discovered species. When one of the Python team left a bag unattended in the lobby, for a matter of minutes, the manager responded not by asking whose it was, but by throwing it over a wall, apparently convinced it was some kind of device. When another team member used his cutlery in a manner the manager deemed incorrect, the man strode over to correct him, as though improper fork technique were a violation of hotel policy serious enough to warrant intervention. The paranoia, the rudeness, the extraordinary gap between the man's self-image as a refined professional and the reality of his conduct, Cleese recognized something in all of this. Not just material, a character, a fully formed, utterly believable, magnificently absurd human type. What emerged years later in collaboration with his then-wife and co-writer Connie Booth was Basil Fawlty. The show premiered on the BBC in September 1975. It ran for 2 series, 6 episodes each, with the second arriving 4 years later in 1979. 12 episodes in total. That modest number is one of the most misleading statistics in the history of British culture because those 12 episodes exerted an influence on television comedy that no reasonable quantity of episodes should be able to generate. Critics were initially uncertain. Audiences were immediately certain. The show gathered momentum through word of mouth, through repeated viewing, through the simple and irresistible fact that was extraordinarily funny. The comedy of Fawlty Towers operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which is part of why it has endured so stubbornly. On the surface, it was broad. Slapstick, farce, mistaken identity, physical comedy, the show deployed all of these with tremendous energy and precision. But underneath the chaos was something more considered, more pointed. Basil Fawlty was not just a comic character. He was a study in a very particular kind of English failure. He was a man who believed himself to be of finer stuff than his circumstances allowed, trapped in a mediocre seaside hotel, surrounded by people he considered his inferiors, desperately and unsuccessfully performing the role of a gentleman he had never quite managed to become. His snobbery was real. His anxiety was real. His fury at the universe's failure to recognize his obvious worth was entirely, painfully real. And the comedy came not from Basil triumphing, he never did, but from watching him unravel. John Cleese's performance was central to this. He brought to Basil a physicality that matched the character's internal chaos, the height, the angular movements, the eyes that could shift in a single moment from exaggerated politeness to barely concealed rage. Prunella Scales, as Basil's wife Sybil, provided the perfect counterweight, a woman of formidable will and devastating accuracy, able to deflate her husband's pretensions with a single well-timed syllable. Connie Booth's Polly was the audience's surrogate, competent, clear-eyed, perpetually exasperated by the situation she found herself managing. And Andrew Sachs as Manuel, the Spanish waiter whose grasp of English was eternally optimistic and entirely insufficient, gave the show one of its most enduring and beloved figures. Manuel was not stupid. The show was always careful to establish that. He was simply operating in a language he had not yet fully conquered, surrounded by a man whose communication skills were, in their own way, equally catastrophic. The ensemble worked. The writing worked. The timing, both in the scripting and the performance, was exceptional. Each episode was constructed with an almost mechanical precision, a series of misunderstandings and escalating disasters built on a single initial error, compounding and accelerating until the inevitable collapse. Cleese and Booth wrote slowly and painstakingly, polishing every line, testing every beat. The result was comedy that felt simultaneously spontaneous and inevitable, chaotic and perfectly controlled. And then came the episode that changed everything. The 6th episode of the first series was titled The Germans. It aired on the BBC in October 1975, and from its opening moments it established itself as something different in tone from what had come before. The episode begins with Basil suffering a concussion. He has been struck on the head, leaving him in a state of addled vulnerability that strips away whatever thin layer of social competence he normally possesses. This is the engine of the episode's comedy. A man who is already barely functional has had his inhibitions and his filters further reduced by a blow to the skull. Whatever thoughts enter Basil's concussed brain are likely to exit through his mouth with minimal processing. Into this already precarious situation arrives a group of German tourists. Perfectly pleasant guests by all appearances. Guests who simply want to check in, settle their room arrangements, and enjoy a quiet stay at the hotel. Basil, aware of his own compromised state and of the social minefield he is navigating, issues himself a strict instruction. He will not mention the war. He will not reference the Second World War. He will not say anything that could conceivably be construed as a reference to the Second World War. He is absolutely clear on this point, both with himself and with his staff. No mention of the war. Under any circumstances. None. What happens next is perhaps the most precise and excruciating depiction of a person's anxious preoccupation manifesting as exactly the thing they most desperately wish to avoid. The more firmly Basil tells himself not to mention the war, the more completely and catastrophically he mentions it. The references begin small, an unwise word choice here, an unfortunate association there. They escalate. They compound. They accelerate into a full, spectacular breakdown in which Basil, convinced he has already ruined everything beyond repair, abandons all restraint entirely. What follows involves impressions, gestures, and a physical performance that was, in the context of mid-70s British television, genuinely shocking. It was funny. Many viewers found it extraordinarily funny. But it was the kind of funny that arrives with an edge, the kind that makes you aware, even as you laugh, that you are laughing at something that carries weight. The joke was not, as Cleese always insisted, aimed at German people. The German tourists in the episode are among its most dignified figures. They respond to Basil's behavior with confusion, and then with the quiet, appalled recognition that the man before them has entirely lost control of himself. The target of the comedy was Basil. It was always Basil. More specifically, the episode was targeting something about the British relationship with the Second World War, the way the conflict had calcified in certain quarters into a defining national identity, something to be referenced and invoked, sometimes in ways that revealed more about the person doing the invoking than about history itself. Basil's inability to stop mentioning the war was, at its core, a portrait of a specific kind of English obsession. That was the intention. The reception was more complicated. Letters arrived at the BBC in significant numbers. Some viewers found the episode distasteful. Some found it offensive. Some felt that comedy had no business approaching the territory of the Second World War at all, regardless of its angle or intent. BBC executives engaged in serious internal discussion about the episode's future. There were voices arguing that it should be withdrawn, that it had crossed a line the corporation should not be associated with having crossed. Others defended it. The debate was genuine, and the outcome not predetermined. In the end, the episode remained, but the conversation around it did not end. It continued through reruns, through the show's growing cultural prominence, through the decades that followed. Each time a new generation encountered Fawlty Towers, they encountered the Germans, and each time they debated it, sometimes with the original sense that it was satire hitting its intended target, sometimes with the growing discomfort of an era increasingly attentive to the potential for comedy to wound. The most recent chapter in this long debate came with the arrival of streaming platforms and their retrospective examination of classic television. When Fawlty Towers became available on various streaming services, The Germans was subject to fresh scrutiny. The episode was edited on some platforms. Specific lines were removed. On others, the episode was prefaced with contextual information. On a small number, it was removed from a catalog entirely. Each of these decisions provoked reaction. Longtime fans of the show were vocal and often furious, arguing that editorial decisions of this kind misunderstood the nature of the comedy, that they patronized audiences, and that they represented an erasure of cultural history in the name of a sensitivity that the show itself was actively critiquing. John Cleese responded to the editing of his work with characteristic directness. He argued publicly and emphatically that the removal or alteration of content created by himself and Connie Booth misrepresented what the show was doing. The point of the episode, as he explained it repeatedly, was that Basil Fawlty was the problem. Basil was the one who could not stop. Basil was the one who made a fool of himself. The German guests were not humiliated. The German guests were bystanders to an Englishman's spectacular self-destruction. To remove or sanitize that content was, in Cleese's view, to destroy the satire without understanding what the satire was aimed at. The argument has merit. It is genuinely possible to watch The Germans and understand it as a piece of work that makes Basil Fawlty look absurd precisely because of his obsession, not in spite of it. The episode does not celebrate what Basil does. It mortifies him by it. The Germans are patient, bemused, and ultimately leave having witnessed something undignified that says nothing about them and everything about their host. Read that way, the episode is a sophisticated piece of comedy that uses shock and discomfort deliberately as tools in service of a clear satirical point. But it is also possible to watch the same episode and feel that certain moments carry a weight of discomfort that no framing entirely neutralizes. Comedy about the Second World War, involving impressions and physical gesture, touches material so historically charged that its reception will always be divided. The show is asking its audience to do something genuinely difficult, to laugh at a specific British pathology while simultaneously processing content that, presented in any other context, would not be funny at all. That is a demanding thing to ask of an audience, and not every viewer will be in a position to make that separation. The debate is not simply between people who understand the joke and people who don't. It is between different, legitimate ways of responding to comedy that operates in sensitive territory. What is remarkable is that this debate has remained alive for 50 years. Most television controversies fade. They are overtaken by new controversies, by changing circumstances, by the simple passage of time. The conversation around the Germans has not faded. It has, if anything, intensified as the cultural moment has shifted. Every few years, something reignites it, a streaming decision, a comment from Cleese, an anniversary, a renewed critical examination of the show's legacy. The episode exists in a state of permanent controversy, which is perhaps the most extraordinary achievement of a piece of television that began as 12 episodes of a BBC sitcom about a hapless hotel manager. The broader story of Fawlty Towers is, of course, one of improbable triumph. A show initially greeted with critical uncertainty became, in the assessment of the British Film Institute at the turn of the millennium, the greatest British television series ever made. A show made in 12 episodes across 2 series left a mark on popular culture that shows made over 10 or 20 seasons routinely fail to achieve. It is quoted everywhere. It is studied in drama schools. It is referenced in newspapers, in political speeches, in ordinary conversation. The phrases it generated, "Don't mention the war," the very name Basil Fawlty, have achieved the status of common cultural property. The cast who made it gave a great deal to the process. Andrew Sachs, whose Manuel became one of the most beloved characters in British comedy, sustained real physical injuries during filming. A frying pan used in a scene turned out, on one occasion, to be rather more solid than intended, leaving a genuine bruise. Burns from a fire scene. The ordinary minor catastrophes of physical comedy, accepted without complaint by a performer entirely committed to the work. Sachs continued acting for decades after the show ended, appearing in beloved British series across multiple genres before his death in 2016. Prunella Scales, whose Sybil was a performance of the highest comic skill, imperious, cutting, and somehow also utterly human, continued a distinguished acting career before illness in later life began to affect her. Her husband, the actor Timothy West, has spoken with great tenderness about caring for her. Connie Booth, who co-wrote the show alongside her creative and marital partnership with Cleese, made a decision after Fawlty Towers that surprised many who knew her work. She stepped away from entertainment entirely and retrained as a psychotherapist. The woman who helped construct one of the most chaotic comedies in British television history chose, for her second act, a profession dedicated to bringing order to chaos. Cleese himself, now in his 80s, remains entirely himself, which is to say, entirely unwilling to be quiet. In 2023, he announced plans for a new version of Fawlty Towers, co-written with his daughter Camilla Cleese. The announcement generated the full spectrum of response: excitement from those who trust Cleese's instincts, anxiety from those who wonder whether the original can possibly be improved upon or successfully extended, and the background noise of cultural commentary questioning whether the sensibility that made the original great can function in an entirely changed media landscape. That question, whether Fawlty Towers or something genuinely like it could be made today, may be the most interesting one the show's legacy raises. The original worked because it was willing to be uncomfortable. It was willing to make its central character a figure of real unpleasantness, not cartoon villainy, but the specific, recognizable unpleasantness of a man whose insecurities have curdled into snobbery, whose social anxiety has calcified into aggression. Basil Fawlty is not likable in any conventional sense. He is watchable. He is compelling. He is, in his catastrophic way, understandable. We laugh at him, but we also recognize him, recognize the gap between aspiration and reality, between the self-image we project and the person others can see clearly. That recognition is what gives the comedy its depth, its durability, its edge. The Germans pushed that edge further than any other episode. It did not just make Basil embarrassing. It made him genuinely difficult to watch for reasons that go beyond simple awkwardness into something more historically loaded, and therefore more complicated to process as comedy. That it managed to do this while simultaneously remaining, in the view of many serious critics and many ordinary viewers, one of the finest pieces of British television comedy ever made is the paradox at the heart of its legacy. Some television moments are remembered because they were wonderful. Some are remembered because they were terrible. The best moments, the ones that define a show, that define an era, that refuse to settle into a simple verdict, are remembered because they were both things at once, because they demand something from the audience that the audience is not quite sure how to give. Fawlty Towers gave British television one of those moments. It has been arguing about it ever since. And the argument 50 years on shows no sign whatsoever of reaching a conclusion.